excited to introduce our two speakers today. And I should say that Labor Commissioner Erica Thunder was also going to join us today, but unfortunately got called away for an urgent family matter and so could not be here today. She shared her notes with our two panelists, Nanisa and Julie, but of course, I know I'll miss her presence today, but she did kindly share the content of what she was going to share. So, but with that said, let me introduce our two speakers. I'm going to spotlight them. First, I'd like to introduce Nanisa Pareles, who is a program analyst at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. During her tenure with EEOC, Ms. Pareles has served as Supervisory Investigator, coaching teams of investigators involved in all types of employment discrimination cases. She has trained and mentored EEO investigators from coast to coast. In addition, she has been selected to train both internal and external customers on EEOC statutes, and she has been part of national development teams for investigative training and compliance materials. She has led teams of investigators for over a decade with a focus on partnership, empathy, and efficiency. Those efforts have led to strong results, including millions of dollars in relief for affected parties. Ms. Pereles is a Partnership for Public Service 2021 Leadership Cohort graduate. Before her work at EEOC, she was an immigration officer and a high school teacher. She received a Bachelor of Science in Communications from Southwestern Oklahoma State University and a Master of Arts in Communications from Oklahoma State University. Welcome, Nanisa. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Julie Wilensky, who is a senior staff attorney at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, where her work focuses on litigation and advocacy to ensure the equal treatment of LGBTQ+ people. She also serves as an appointed council member on the California Fair Employment and Housing Council. Before joining NCLR, Julie was a deputy county counsel at the Santa Clara County Council's office. Oops, sorry, I lost my place. Where she was a member of the Social Justice and Impact Litigation team. Previously, she was director of the California Office of the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center and a shareholder at an employment and civil rights law firm in Oakland. She served as a law clerk to Judge John T. Noonan Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and to Judge Nicholas G. Garafis, of U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Julie is a graduate of Yale Law School and Yale College. Welcome, Julie, and thanks for speaking today. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, and it's so wonderful to be here today with all of you.
And with that, I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Great, thank you so much, Ming, and thank you again for having us here today. It's great to be here virtually with all of you. I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint that we have. And so please let me know. All right, is that coming up for everybody?
Yeah, that's good, Julie.
Okay. Thanks. So this session today will be on employment, and I think employment is a really important topic, just given the role that work plays in our lives and the importance of work to people's ability to support themselves and their loved ones. So our focus of this session will be on the rights of employees to be free from discrimination and harassment at work under federal law and state law in North Dakota. And we're going to cover what you can do if you experience discrimination or harassment, and also the role of the federal and state agencies that enforce laws that prohibit discrimination and harassment at work. And before we dive into that, I just want to flag that there are so many legal issues that can come up with employment. For example, whether workers are being paid properly for overtime or meal and rest breaks. There are issues around sick leave and family leave and other kinds of leave. Issues come up when employees get injured at work, or issues relating to workers organizing and unionizing. And all of those issues are really beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about today. So what we're going to focus on today is discrimination protections to be free from discrimination and harassment in the workplace. I am so honored to be here with Nanisa from the EEOC. And as Ming mentioned, we're sad that Commissioner Thunder from the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights wasn't able to join us, unfortunately. So we are missing her today. If you have questions, as Ming said, you can put them in the chat. You can put them in the chat to the group. You can chat directly to us, or and feel free to ask questions as we go. And there will also be some time at the end. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Nanisa, who will talk a little bit more about what employment discrimination is.
Thank you so much, Julie. So let's talk a little bit about employment discrimination. As you can see here, we've flagged it in plain language for you. And why might that be? Well, in our culture today, we talk about words like discrimination and harassment, and we do it often, right? Like that, those are words that get dropped a lot. And so what we wanted to do today during our chat was really get into what it means to be discriminated against. What does it really mean when somebody says that? So what it truly means is that a person or a group of people are treated differently than another group of people or a different person. And in the context of what we're dealing with today, we're talking about it at work. And so you might see that we're talking about it also in the context of home, school, or of a public place, specifically when those places show up as places of employment. So during the summit, you might hear people talking about discrimination or bad things that are happening in any one of those contexts, but here during this session, we're talking about it as it relates to employment. So we want to make sure that we're creating this sort of carve out for discrimination that has to do with I am an employee or an applicant to that job site and a bad thing happened. So as we're going through these slides, we're going to deal with things that have to do with a bad thing that happened at a work site. And a work site can take the shape of any one of these things that's listed here. A home, a school, a public place, all of those things. But in our context, it's going to deal with something to do with employment. Now, not all bad things that happen are illegal. And now you might say, well, why is that? The truth is that culture moves a lot faster than our legal system does. And one of the things that you're going to hear from us, particularly as you start to hear from Julie talking about some of the cases that are really important to the LGBTQ plus community, you'll hear that Congress and state legislatures have carved out certain characteristics or traits among us that we have said as communities need special attention. Now, many of us have said, well, there are more than those characteristics, and we need to pay attention to those. And we are starting to do that by pushing the law in that direction. And we do that by those cases that Julie's going to talk to you about, and eventually changing the law itself. But that process is really slow. So that's why I say that culture moves significantly faster than the law itself does. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't champion change, that we shouldn't advocate for change, but we should have a clear eye about the difference between where culture stands and where the law stands. And hopefully through our conversation today, you're going to see where those two places hang out. Julie?
Thanks, Nanisa. So we're going to turn to as a backdrop for our discussion today, and probably something that is not news to anyone at this summit, is that discrimination against LGBTQ plus people continues to be widespread, and that's in many areas of life, including employment. And it also goes without saying that employment discrimination has really harmful consequences. It can have, if you lose your job because of discrimination, or are paid less or denied opportunities for promotion, it can really have a life-altering financial impact. It could lead to someone losing their housing. And there's also a lot of research showing that the stress from discrimination can also affect people's physical and mental health outcomes as well. And so we put some statistics on the slide that just highlight that discrimination continues to be widespread against LGBTQ plus people. And that's more than 1 in 3 LGBTQ plus people in America face discrimination of some kind in the last year. And that includes more than 3 in 5 transgender people. And it's important to highlight that our LGBTQ plus community is very diverse, and people within that community are affected in different ways by discrimination. And transgender people experience particularly high rates of discrimination, and LGBTQ plus people of color, especially transgender LGBTQ plus people of color, experience extremely high rates of discrimination as well. And just as one example, data from the US Transgender Survey, which was a national survey of about 28,000 transgender people, from that in that survey, of the folks who had applied for a job in the year before the survey or had a job in the year before the survey, 49% of Native American transgender women and 47% of Black transgender women reported that they were fired, denied a promotion, or not being hired for a job in the last year because they're transgender. And those numbers are just staggering. And I think it's important to keep in mind that workplace protections for LGBTQ plus people are particularly important for those who already face discrimination based on other protected characteristics. So we just wanted to provide that as important context. And now I'll turn it over to Nanisa to talk about forms of discrimination in the workplace.
And so when we talk about discrimination in the workplace, you see here a list, and I want you to think about this as a sample list rather than a comprehensive list of bad things that can happen at work. Everything from not being given an opportunity for a job, being denied a promotion, being fired from a job. These are bad things that can happen at work, what EEOC refers to as an issue. So again, these are actions that happen against a person. And I want to pause here for just a second and say, these are things, actions, again, bad things that can happen to you for a variety of reasons. So it's not just because of LGBTQ plus status. There are many reasons why this could happen to a person. So the first step in considering whether something is discrimination is this here. It's the idea of what happened. What is the bad thing? And so when you're considering whether discrimination has occurred, you need to have, number one, a bad thing that has happened. And number two, you need to put yourself through a process of asking why. And that why is going to take us into the next slide, Julie, if you don't mind. And the reason why I say that is because this slide here is what starts to help us build a foundation of establishing what we call jurisdiction, is what lets us in the door to see if what's occurring is based on the laws that EEOC enforces. Now, take a look at these bullet points here, where we're talking about what the laws EEOC enforces have to do with particular traits that belong to a person. So notice we have race, color, national origin, religion, sex, which, by the way, at EEOC includes pregnancy, gender identity, sexual orientation, and the list goes on to age, which is 40 plus, and genetic information. Now, this is important because I want you to imagine in your mind's eye 2 pillars. So in the previous slide, we had a list of bad things, and that's the first pillar. Bad things. A bad thing has occurred to me, an issue. And the second pillar is going to be built by one of these items. So let us imagine that I get fired, and I put that in my first pillar. And in my second pillar, I say I got fired because of my gender identity. two pillars. So an issue, a bad thing, and a basis, a reason why. I've got two pillars standing side by side. Now, in order for us to move forward with this, what we're calling a charge, a complaint, we have to build a bridge that connects them. And that bridge is going to be the evidence that you're going to provide as part of that conversation, information, and discrimination happens via comparisons. So you might ask yourself, so how do I do that, Nanisa? How do I build that bridge that you're talking about? The way you do that is you say, well, if I got fired because of my gender identity, why would I believe that it's my gender identity? Who didn't get fired, who is of a different gender identity? Is everybody putting this together with me? And the reason I'm saying all of this is because I'm hoping that when we finish our conversation, the chat's just going to blow up with questions about this piece right here, because this is at the core of how discrimination works. So I'm hoping that you're staying with me as I'm doing this, right? So remember, pillar number one is an issue, a bad thing. Pillar number two is a reason why you believe that bad thing happened. And the bridge between the two is the evidence. And you're going to be paying attention to how you're going to create that comparison between yourself and someone who was treated better than you. Good? Now notice in the very bottom, that bottom bullet, we're saying we need 15 or more employees to have coverage, 20 or more for the Age Act. Okay, so that's a key component to how we establish jurisdiction. All right, we can keep going, Julie. I can talk about this all day, so we better keep going.
Thanks, Nanisa. So we're going to shift into talking about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that is the federal law that prohibits discrimination in employment because of sex and other protected characteristics. And the reason we're focusing on Title VII today is, and spending some time on that, is that's the source of protections under federal law for LGBTQ plus people. And in a really significant decision in 2020, the US Supreme Court confirmed that discriminating against a person because that person is LGBTQ plus is discrimination because of sex. And that was the Bostock versus Clayton County case, which was actually 3 cases. And those were 3 cases that involved LGBTQ plaintiffs, 2 gay men and a transgender woman. And the allegations in those cases were very straightforward. It was once the employer learned that the employees were gay or transgender, they were fired. And pictured on the slide is Amy Stevens. And she's the plaintiff who's a transgender woman in the case, in one of these cases. And she actually passed away in May of 2020, but right before the Supreme Court issued its decision in her favor in June. And Amy Stevens was a funeral director in Michigan, and she was fired from her longtime employer when she told her employer that she was a transgender woman. And so in this Bostock case, the Supreme Court concluded that you can't discriminate against someone for being LGBTQ without also discriminating against them based on sex. And the reason that the Supreme Court gave was that the employer is basically penalizing a person of one sex for traits or actions that it's fine with in people of a different sex. So for example, if an employer fires Sue because she has a wife, but the employer wouldn't fire Bob for having a wife, then the employer is discriminating against Sue because of her sex. And this is something that lower courts had been dealing with for decades. This wasn't like a new issue. But with the Bostock case in 2020, the Supreme Court conclusively decided that issue nationwide under federal law. So under the Bostock case, LGBTQ plus people across the country are protected from sex discrimination under Title VII. And the Biden administration has interpreted the reasoning in Bostock of what it means to experience discrimination because of sex to apply to other federal laws that prohibit discrimination based on sex in other contexts. So one example is the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits sex discrimination in housing. And the reason for that interpretation is that the language of the laws is very similar, if not identical. And so what it means to discriminate based on sex in employment is the same as what it means to discriminate based on sex in housing or other contexts. Just as a side note, you may be familiar with the proposed Equality Act, which is a legislative proposal in Congress that would amend federal civil rights law in many different contexts to include explicit protections from discrimination for LGBTQ people in nearly every aspect of federal law. So for example, where the law says sex, it would add sexual orientation and gender identity. And that the Equality Act would also provide important new legal protections for women and expand existing protections for people of color, immigrants, and religious minorities in an important way. So I'm not going to get into more detail on that, but I just wanted to flag that that is out there. And we at NCLR think that passing the Equality Act is critically important to protect LGBTQ+ communities and many others from discrimination. I'm now going to turn to state anti-discrimination protections. And I'm just going to briefly mention the North Dakota Human Rights Act, which is the state law in North Dakota that prohibits employment discrimination based on sex and other characteristics. And we've put all the characteristics up here on the slide, and you'll see that there are some similarities, a lot of overlap with federal law, but it also includes some other characteristics. For example, marital status, which is not prohibited under Title VII. And it also significantly applies to smaller employers. So to be covered under the North Dakota state law, an employer just has to have one or more employees. And so, and that covers more employers than Title VII does under federal law, because as Nanisa said, you need at least 15 employees to have the federal protections of Title VII. So there are other similarities and differences that we're not going to get into the details today, but just to provide a quick overview of that. I mentioned earlier that the Bostock Supreme Court case in 2020 has had a big impact on federal law, and it's also had a big impact on state laws. And it's had a particular impact in North Dakota, because only 3 days after Bostock, the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights announced that that decision may and should be applied to the North Dakota Human Rights Act and the Housing Discrimination Act. And so this was a really important development. And I wish Commissioner Thunder were here with us today to talk more about it, because you would certainly want to hear more about it from her. But what this means is that the department has been accepting and investigating complaints of discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in all the human rights laws that the department enforces. And so that's really huge. It's a big development. And so it means that if a person files a complaint saying I was discriminated against because I'm gay, for example, the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights will investigate that as a potential violation of the State Human Rights Act, just as if someone filed a complaint saying I was discriminated against because I'm a man. And so this is a really big development. And it shows the impact that the Supreme Court decision had on state law. And one reason for that is that many states, when they're interpreting their anti-discrimination laws, look to how similar federal laws have been interpreted. And so just as Title VII prohibits sex discrimination, so does the North Dakota Human Rights Act. And so that's the basis for that change. I'm now going to turn to what you can do if you experience discrimination. And we put some tips up on the slide, and I'm not going to read them one by one, but just to give kind of a quick overview is that one principle to keep in mind is you want to protect yourself. And so it can be helpful to keep a journal at home where you record incidents of suspected discrimination or harassment, write down dates or times or witnesses. And the reason for this is that documenting wrongful conduct will, when it happens, will help if you ever need to take action, such as a lawsuit. Do not use your work computer or your work email. It's something that if you're concerned that you've experienced discrimination in the workplace, your employer has access to your work computer and work email. So it'd be best to do this at home with your own materials. It's helpful to keep copies of important documents or letters or communications that you get or send to your employer. And also, if you're experiencing harassment based on race or sex or sexual orientation or gender identity, it's also helpful and important to complain to a manager or supervisor promptly, or human resources. And the reason for that is that if you don't complain, the employer might later say that it didn't know about the harassment. Another tip is just if you're asked to sign something, to be careful of being asked to sign anything by your employer. Try to get legal advice if you can, especially if your employer wants you to sign something that would waive your right to bring a complaint or a lawsuit, or that would require you to go to arbitration if you had a dispute with your employer. Another thing to consider is just to consider your options. I think it's generally best to try to resolve the situation informally, by talking to a supervisor or a manager or HR. There may be an employer, your employer might have a grievance procedure, or if you're in a union, you could talk to a union representative. And you could also choose to file a formal complaint of discrimination with the EEOC or the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights, which we'll talk about next. And so I'll just give a very quick overview of reporting discrimination in general, and then Nanisa will talk more specifically about the EEOC. So reporting discrimination, if you want to make a formal complaint under to an agency, you can file a complaint with the EEOC or the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights, and the agency may investigate your complaint and try and resolve the problem. There's no charge to do this. You can do so without an attorney, although it can also be helpful to consult with an attorney to try and get more information about your rights and your situation. And a really important principle to keep in mind, and one that Nanisa and I can't emphasize enough, is just every legal matter has deadlines. And if you don't file a complaint within certain time limits, you might lose your right to legal protection from the discrimination or harassment. And so that's incredibly important to keep in mind, especially because sometimes an employee might not learn that they were discriminated against until long after it's already happened. And so it's just very important to be aware that that all legal matters have deadlines, and that you should not wait if you're thinking about filing a complaint. And so now Nanisa will talk more about the EEOC. There we go.
So before I jump into this information specifically, I wanted to draw everybody's attention to the chat, because we have a ton of information that's flowing there about resources. I'm incredibly fortunate to be joined today by one of my colleagues, Maria Flores, who is dropping all kinds of links about EEOC information. And so you can check out the chat. There are resources of information, but also she dropped the link for how to file a charge. And so that's going to be incredibly relevant to what I'm going to say next. But if you are in any way interested in getting information about how EEOC operates, all the bases that EEOC deals with, where our offices are, and then drilling down into the LGBTQ plus information. She even gave you specific information about that topic. There's a specific link for that. So check it out. It's in the chat. It's very helpful. Thank you, Maria, for doing that. But turning back to this slide, one of the things I want to make sure and cover during our conversation today is that we have staff all over the country who know how to deal with discrimination. This is what we do. And so why would you want to sit at home with questions or doubts about something that has to do with an employment potentially discriminatory event and not just reach out and talk to somebody absolutely for free? It costs you nothing to talk to EEOC. And so I say the best thing that you can do is, number one, go to our website, eeoc.gov, check out all the information that we have, but ultimately make an appointment to talk to somebody. We have found that one of the very best ways to deal with these issues is to actually talk to one of our staff members. Yes, the internet is wonderful. We can all get access to information via a bunch of different sources, but ultimately talking to one of our staff members is going to help you, because you can drill down to the specifics of your situation right there with somebody who is very well trained to figure out whether what you're going through is covered by our laws. Additionally, what they'll be able to do is give you ideas about other things that may have nothing to do with EEOC. Remember, at the top of our chat, we mentioned that there are things that are not covered by EEOC, but might be covered by somebody else. And so we might be able to steer you in a completely different direction. So talking to us is going to be a good and solid investment of your time. So go to our website, connect with us, connect with somebody at the state agency, connect with somebody at one of the not-for-profits. The point is, don't sit at home. And like Julie mentioned to you in the previous slide, because there are deadlines, if you wait, you're running into the possibility that you won't be able to exercise that right anyway. So let's say that you decide that you do want to talk to EEOC, but you do it too late. Let's go to that next slide, Julie, real quick. The problem is that you have 300 days to file a charge with EEOC. And if you've gone beyond those 300 days, there's nothing we can do to change that for you. However, let's say that you do go for it before the 300 days expired, and it turns out that what you're talking to us about is something that we're like, on the fence about. We have a number of resources that we can engage in, including our free of charge mediation program. So we could figure out if we could resolve that process early on with you, with the employer, and then, hey, everybody goes home happy. So it doesn't necessarily have to lead to, let's go to court and fight this thing out. There are a number of ways that this thing can be resolved, but you first have to come see us and talk to us about those options. So I always advocate for information. Go to the website. And number two, make an appointment. No one's going to know you came to talk to us, because the employer doesn't know that you connected with EEOC unless you decide to file a formal charge. Until that moment, it's just between you and me. It's just us. We're the only ones who know it. So until that official charge is filed, no one has to know. So you're better off just getting the information and then make a decision for yourself about what is best for you once you're fully informed. That's your best bet. Be fully informed. So if you learn nothing else from our chat today, the best option for you is always to get the most information. And the way to do that is go check out the website and also make an appointment. Julie?
Thanks, Nanisa. And I can't emphasize enough that being fully informed is always a good thing, for sure. Before turning to the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights, I want to go back and answer a question that came up in the chat, which was when we were talking about the scope of the Bostock decision on Title VII, saying that sex discrimination includes discrimination against LGBTQ plus people. The question that we got from Kip Harris is it conceivable that a future president might advise federal agencies to interpret Bostock in a different way? In other words, are LGBTQ plus people still at risk without additional laws being enacted? And the short answer to both of those questions is yes. And actually, the Trump administration took a pretty restrictive view of the Bostock decision throughout the second half of 2020, when that administration was still in office. And it's certainly conceivable that there might be a different interpretation in the future. And so I think that it is, while Bostock is a momentous decision and it's extremely important, it is most protective to have laws that explicitly include sexual orientation and gender identity in them. I also want to just highlight a point made in the chat about Commissioner Thunder being a rock star and how she provided leadership on implementing Bostock under North Dakota state law. Absolutely. And I think it's really powerful that that came from the agency itself. And it wasn't a question that had to kind of come up through the courts, where the state courts are grappling with the issue of, should we apply Bostock to our state law here. And so just wanted to agree with that. And we'll go to the next slide, which is at the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights. And the same principle applies as with the EEOC. Don't wait. You can also file in person, online, or via phone. And similar to federal law, you have to file within 300 days of the discrimination or harassment. And there's a little asterisk there. There's additional rules about if a complaint is against the state itself. And same on the previous slide for federal employees. And again, Nanisa and I today are trying to provide an overview of general information, but there are specific things that apply to, for example, state employees or federal employees. And so it's really important to take advantage of the information on the websites from these agencies. The North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights has a really helpful brochure that kind of goes through the process, how to do it, and what is covered. And so similar to the process under the EEOC, there are multiple ways in which to reach out and make an appointment and talk to an intake counselor. Okay. And then here we have contact information for these agencies. We put the EEOC's public portal, which I saw Nanisa's colleague has also put in the chat, so you can submit an inquiry or schedule an appointment. Same thing with the state agency. And I also put up a link to NCLR's legal helpline, where we can provide general information and resources as well. And so we cannot act as your, if you call the helpline at NCLR, we cannot act as your attorney and represent you in legal proceedings, but we can provide general information and other legal resources to help you learn more about your rights. And so with that, I'm happy to hand it back to Nanisa or open it up for questions from here.
I just have one final comment to make about the Bostock piece. I want to highlight the fact that long before the decision in Bostock, EEOC was taking the position that sexual orientation and gender identity were covered under because of sex, and we were pushing for the enforcement of that aspect of the law. So in fact, we were at odds with the Department of Justice on that position. So it is possible for the government to continue to do one thing or another. And I think you're absolutely right that is why the Equality Act is needed.
Agreed. And in addition to the EEOC's positions that were protective and inclusive of LGBTQ people under Title VII, it's something that attorneys had been litigating in the federal courts for decades, going back to the 1970s, of whether the sex discrimination provision in Title VII applies to LGBTQ plaintiffs. And so Bostock really answers that question conclusively nationwide. And it's something that it's been resolved at the highest level of courts.